And welcome back. I'm Ben Swan, filling in for Steve Malzberg. Well, based on the interview I just did with Armstrong Williams, the spirited discussion we had, we have a lot to talk about with our Malzberg panel. Joining me to respond to the militarization of America's police is the co-host of Steele Ungar on SiriusXM, Rick Ungar, and the senior partner and owner of the law offices of Adam M. Thompson and syndicated talk show host and TV commentator Adam M. Thompson. Gentlemen, thank you for being with me.
Always a pleasure.
All right, so let's talk about militarization of police. You heard the discussion that right now, I am assuming you heard it, that I was having with Armstrong Williams. Militarization is a huge story. It's something we've been covering for a long time, but most of America has had no clue that it was actually there. Rick, is this something that's a wake-up call for people to say, you need to understand where these supplies are, who they're going to, and how they're going to be used?
I think you have to be a little bit careful. I actually have no objection to these supplies being filtered down into local police forces. The difference is how they're used. Let's always remember, our military has a particular job. They exist to kill people. That's unfortunately part of what they're there for. They have to do that and to protect us. The local police force has a very different role. They are there to, as the saying goes, protect and serve, not kill people. Of course, sometimes it has to be that way. As a result, what equipment may be used for different things should vary. So pulling out all the military equipment when the real role was to protect the citizens of that town from people who might wish them ill or try to be doing something that was not legal, wrong place to use it.
Okay, but like in this case, Adam, we've seen across the country, I mean, various stories of police will go and they'll go into a particular area with flashbangs, throw them through windows. You've got children inside those homes. In one case, there was a baby girl, her face, I think she received third-degree burns. I mean, these are serious issues because, again, as Rick was just saying, I mean, this is an issue of weapons that are designed to kill and maim. That's the nature of war, but is that the nature of policing?
That's what the big problem is. That isn't the nature of policing. The nature of policing is to serve and protect. And the military is to seek out an enemy. Remember, the military deals with enemies of the country, of the nation, to seek out enemies and destroy. That's it. So when you start overlapping that militarization comes to local law enforcement, it's a conflicting ideology on what to do. One is to seek out enemies and kill, and then one is to serve and protect. How does that mesh together? The answer is that it doesn't. We shouldn't really see these militarized weapons and vehicles coming down to local theaters near you. It shouldn't be that way. And the big problem is, think of all the training that our military goes through to understand how these weapons work, how these motorized vehicles work. It takes a very long time to learn them and then implement them. And they're just being trickled down to local law enforcement. Is the same amount and degree of training going into local law enforcement to even learn how to use these different apparatuses? And in most cases, it's very minimal, which means that you're setting up something where people are going to be using certain advanced weaponry or techniques that they're not even properly trained in. That just leads to disaster.
Well, one of the issues, Rick, has got to be also the fact that we have, militarization is more than equipment.
Right.
Many times when we look at militarization, we'll say things like, well, with the militarization of police, it's tanks, it's Bearcats, it's MRAPs, which we've been talking about. But it's also tactics and how police are being trained. When you view someone in a war zone who is a civilian or someone who might be a threat, as you mentioned, I mean, it's the action of killing someone. Police have a very different standard and burden on them under the rule of law, do they not?
It's actually a really good point, and we've got a major problem here because Adam and I are agreeing, and that can never be a good thing. But you make a very good point. Look at what we saw in those opening days in Missouri. You saw military equipment out there. You saw a 50 caliber machine gun on a truck aimed at the people. But you know what you didn't see? You didn't see police officers, happily, behaving like soldiers. That was the incongruity of it, and that's why this approach never made sense. If you're going to pull out the military equipment, you should be on a military mission, and that's not what that was about.
Go back to, the Occupy protests. Go to, any time that we've seen really in recent time here, Adam, where we have serious issues of civilian populations who are protesting and then police tactics that are used against them. How do we go through a process of training police to say, remember the mantra, as you pointed out a minute ago, serve and protect? The serve part of that is very important. Serving the community means that you don't just beat first and ask questions later, does it not?
Absolutely. I have to agree with that. I mean, basically, you have to remember what the purpose of police and law enforcement is. It's to serve and protect the public. And when situations change, such as we see in Occupy, what's been going on in Ferguson, sometimes police tactics have to progressively, that's the key word here, progressively get, more enlarged and widespread and crowd control. If you have a protesting crowd and they're peaceful, you should leave it alone. Let people exercise their First Amendment rights. But when you get members of the crowd that become violent, is it the overall crowd, or is it just certain portions or segments of the crowd? Then isolate them, pull them out. There's so many different crowd control tactics that police are trained in. They could use the bare minimal force necessary to keep everyone's rights in place. And I'm very big on our individual rights being allowed to be exercised. I don't want to see them trampled on at all. But at the same time, law enforcement has a hard job. And unfortunately, sometimes they have to use escalated principles to control a situation. That's when and how all the talk of militarization is coming into play, because what do they do when it gets to that next step and basic local law enforcement principles aren't working? There has to be something more they do. What the more they do is what we're all debating about now. How far does it go? Water cannons? Do you use rubber bullets? Do you fire tear gas into crowds? Are we turning our local streets into like Iraq or Afghanistan? People don't want to see that, but in some circumstances, you have to use advanced methods. What are those advanced methods going to be? That's what we have to come to as a resolution within this country.
And Rick, at some point we start to look like the Arab Spring, do we not? We start to have this appearance where we're focused on, taking out the enemy who's in the streets, and as was pointed out, the rubber bullets. How do we prevent it from looking like that kind of a situation? Because that's really what Ferguson looked like. It looked like we were in Egypt.
No question about it. You might as well have been, as you say, in Egypt. Look, I think we've got the start of this when you're seeing literally people from all sides of the political spectrum agreeing that what happened there was not the way to go about this. Now the trick is to build on that. Don't turn this into a political football game, and come together to come up with a better way.
All right, we're going to be back with part 2 of the Malzberg panel, including a discussion about President Obama and is he playing too much golf? Was he playing too much golf after the announcement of journalist James Foley's death? But first, stay tuned for your Newsmax Now update.